For number 2, a due regard must also be had to the solemnity of the ordinance, and the grand purposes it was intended to serve, particularly that one according to which its dispensation specially affects the visible church. Let us consider what it would be to frustrate any of the ends God had in view, much more to bury by our inconsiderate plans of procedure one of the great objects for which we had seen the supper was expressly designed, and to which, even according to its spiritual import as well as external form, it is peculiarly adapted, that of manifesting and confirming the unity of a religious body in faith and profession. Whatever method of observance shall lay a bar in the way of visible communion and of circulation of this throughout the body must militate in so far against the purposed utility of the ordinance, even though spiritual advantage should be consulted. Let us consider also what it would be to efface those marks of importance which God has impressed upon this, as he did on various institutions of the law, in the solemnity of its nature and form. And let us remember that if, in tampering with our own supposed spiritual capacity of preserving the idea of solemnity amid the utmost familiarity with sacred things, we shall overlook that regard God hath had to our weakness in constituting certain ordinances more solemn than others, we are in danger of counteracting even the spiritual utility of these ordinances insofar as it may be connected with the solemnity impressed upon them. God, we have seen, who knows the proper way of managing his people in this imperfect state, had a regard to their condition, as yet in the body and liable to be affected by sensible signs, when he appointed these to be used in the seals of his covenant. On the same principle, did he proceed in annexing peculiar solemnity to some of the legal institutions, and for the sake of this solemnity, appointing them to be observed less frequently than others. The Church is now exalted to a state of greater spirituality. She is more able to bear the mysteries of the kingdom, but her members are not glorified. We must take care of establishing modes of procedure which might seem to imply that no familiarity with holy things and the most solemn exhibitions of them could defeat the very end of such exhibitions. Declamation here on want of piety and heavenly fervor, as if the ideas now stated could not be entertained by any warm and zealous Christian, is of no avail. There may be a zeal which is not according to knowledge. Its language is, "My mountain stands strong, I shall never be moved. Lord, it is good to be here." But what is the indication of God's mind? This is the question. He hath not limited the whole dispensation of grace to the symbolical ordinance under consideration. Were this the case, and were there no opportunity of eating the flesh and drinking the blood of the Son of God, but in it there might be some reason for requiring a constant observance. But he hath, for certain reasons connected with our present state, appointed this ordinance to be a solemn exhibition of the whole dispensation of grace, and these reasons demand respect in settling our method of procedure. What would we have thought of the Jews if, in the way of magnifying the spiritual utility of the Passover, they had condemned the wisdom of God, who appointed it only for an annual feast, or supplicated through the medium of Moses its more frequent celebration? They had been unfriendly to themselves, it may be said, since their request, if granted, would have required them often to travel up to Jerusalem. But, according to the views now entertained by the advocates for frequent communion, this solemn convocation was something that might have been easily dispensed with. The Jew might have said, "This is an ordinance of great spiritual benefit. It is a sacrament as well as a sacrifice. It is different in this respect from our other feasts. Entreat God for us, that we may have it more frequently, and at home in our families apart," as was the case at its first institution in the land of Egypt. They might thus, under a very spiritual pretense, have been saved the trouble of solemn convocation and the expense of going up to Jerusalem to testify in this ordinance the unity of the body. And when we consider that they had other feasts of solemn convocation, it may seem that the plea would have had more weight in regard to the Passover than it can have in regard to its substitute, which is the only feast of communion in the New Testament state. But God had no such respect of old to frequency at the expense of all other considerations, as these apparently very pious sentiments seem to imply. Number 3. The solemnity of the use of the Lord's Supper as the intended pledge of unity claimed to regulate observance, both with respect to frequency and mode. This ought to be admitted unless something to the contrary can be pointed out in the nature of the ordinance, or some positive injunction produced determining the number of times. That there is any such injunction will not be pretended. And we have endeavored to show that there is nothing in the nature or ends of the ordinance that requires more than occasional observance. Now, its spiritual utility cannot alone regulate the frequency of dispensation, for the maxim, which may have got into their mouths, the oftener the better, proves more than they would be disposed to admit. The idea of utility is solely to be attended to. Why not twice, thrice, 4 times a week? And why not to render this convenient private dispensations? But, say the advocates for frequency, the feast must be kept after the due order, publicly in a church assembly, under the proper administrators, etc. The frequency, then, it seems, is not to be regulated entirely by the idea of spiritual importance. Other considerations are to be taken into view. And if the ordinance really possessed the solemnity stated, if it was also designed visibly to display and confirm the unity of a religious body, to declare their fellowship in faith and profession, these are considerations which specially affect its dispensation, and thus hold out a peculiar claim to regulate as to frequency and mode. These 3 positions are generally principles relative to the conclusions deduced from our view of the Lord's Supper. Let us mark more particularly their application in a few instances. First, annual communicating, or the conduct of those who communicate but once a year, must, from what has been stated, appear to be very reprehensible. Such persons show little regard to the importance and spiritual utility of the ordinance. They are guilty also of disrespecting the liberty of more than annual and paschal-like dispensation granted to the New Testament Church, and of disobeying the calls of divine providence in the many opportunities afforded according to this liberty. Number 2. A mere anniversary dispensation would be condemnable. To celebrate the supper but once a year on a set day, suppose Easter, or what is styled Christmas, or any other day, throughout the Christian Church, might seem to favor the idea of solemnity, but it would do so at the expense of what ought not to be kept in view: the importance of the ordinance and its use as the medium of visible communion. First, its spiritual unity would be equally disrespected as by annual communicating, and the disrespect would be more public and glaring. If the conduct of annual communicants be censurable on the grounds specified, on the same ground the Church behoved to be condemned for sanctioning their conduct by a law. Such a law would infringe on the prerogative of Jesus, to whom alone it belongs to appoint sacred days and months and years, as in the legal economy, and who, if he had intended any such peculiarly sacred seasons under the present dispensation, would have marked the times and prohibited the employment of any other. He hath sanctioned no day, but that in the 7th, which takes its designation from himself. This day he hath sanctioned for all the parts of public service, without discriminating among his Sabbaths, which ought to be appropriated to the ordinance of the supper. Nor was there any distinction known in the apostolic age. Paul, it is likely, when he visited the churches to confirm them, dispensed the supper wherever he happened to be present among Christians in an organized state, and on whatever Sabbath was most convenient. Thus, while he was at Thessalonica, the disciples came together to break bread, or to have the ordinance dispensed by him ere he departed. And for this end they honored the first day of the week, the usual day of public worship.